The story of human civilization is one of constant reinvention. From the earliest sparks of fire to the construction of great cities, humanity has always searched for ways to reshape its environment and expand the limits of possibility. Yet, among the many turning points in our shared history, few have been as transformative, as disruptive, or as enduring as the Industrial Revolution. It was a period not merely of invention, but of complete transformation of societies, economies, and even the way people thought about their lives and the future. What began as a series of seemingly local innovations in Britain would ripple outward, forever altering the course of human history and laying the foundations of the modern world. Hello, and welcome to the Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The Industrial Revolution was not a single event, nor did it happen overnight. Rather, it was a complex unfolding of technological, economic, and cultural shifts that stretched across decades and continents. Yet its roots can be traced with surprising clarity. To understand the world that birthed this revolution, we must first return to 18th century Britain, where landscapes of green fields and small villages were about to undergo a metamorphosis unlike anything seen before. For centuries, most people had lived in rural communities. Agriculture was the lifeblood of economies, and life revolved around the rhythms of planting and harvest. Craftsmen produced goods by hand, textiles spun in cottages, tools hammered out in small forges, and wood shaped by carpenters who passed their skills down through generations. It was a world of limits. Production was slow, transportation was difficult, and survival often depended on favorable weather and fragile harvests. And yet, beneath the surface, changes were brewing. Advances in farming during the agricultural revolution, crop rotation, selective breeding, and new tools like the seed drill had increased food production, freeing more people from the land. Populations grew, and with them, demand for goods increased. The stage was set for something new, something powerful, something revolutionary. At the heart of this revolution was energy. For thousands of years, human labor, animal power, wind, and water had been the main sources of energy. But the 18th century witnessed the harnessing of something far more potent: coal. Beneath Britain's soil lay vast deposits of this black rock, and as wood supplies dwindled, coal became the lifeline of industry. Mines dug deeper and deeper into the earth, providing fuel not only for heat, but eventually for machines that would redefine production itself. Yet coal alone was not enough. It needed a partner, a machine capable of converting its potential into motion, power, and productivity. Enter the steam engine. The story of the steam engine is itself a saga of persistence and ingenuity. Early attempts to use steam to pump water from mines had been clumsy and inefficient. But with the work of inventors like Thomas Newcomen in the early 700s and, later, James Watt in the mid-700s, the steam engine was refined into a practical and reliable powerhouse. Watt's improvements, particularly his separate condenser, greatly increased efficiency, making the engine not just a tool for pumping water, but a driver of machinery in factories and transportation. With steam, industries could now operate on a scale previously unimaginable. Power was no longer confined to rivers or human muscle. It could be generated wherever coal was available. This unleashed possibilities that would transform everything from textile production to transportation. Textiles, in particular, became the cradle of industrialization. Britain's booming population demanded more clothing, and merchants saw opportunity in meeting that need. But hand spinning and weaving were far too slow to keep up. A series of inventions, each building upon the last, accelerated the pace of production. The spinning jenny, developed by James Hargreaves, allowed one worker to spin multiple threads at once. Richard Arkwright's water frame harnessed water power to drive spinning machines, leading to the first true factories. Samuel Crompton's spinning mule combined the strengths of earlier machines, producing fine and strong yarn. And Edmund Cartwright's power loom mechanized weaving, completing the chain of innovation. Together, these breakthroughs shifted textile production from cottages to factories, large buildings where machines hum and clattered, powered first by water wheels and later by steam engines. The factory system had been born, and with it, a new way of organizing labor. Factories were more than just centers of production. They were symbols of a new social order. Instead of working at home according to personal rhythms, men, women, and even children flocked to factories where the clock dictated their every move. Time, once tied to the cycles of nature, became measured in hours, shifts, and productivity. For many workers, the factory meant harsh conditions, long hours, repetitive tasks, and dangerous machinery. Yet it also represented wages, opportunities, and, for some, a path out of rural poverty. The human cost of industrialization was immense, but so too were its possibilities. Transportation was another arena transformed by industrial innovation. Moving goods and raw materials had always been a challenge. Roads were muddy and unreliable, and canals, while useful, were limited in scope. Steam power changed this dramatically. The steam locomotive, pioneered by engineers like George Stephenson, brought speed and reliability to land transport. Railways spread rapidly across Britain, linking industrial centers, ports, and cities. The movement of goods became faster, cheaper, and more predictable. People, too, found new freedom of mobility, traveling distances that previous generations could scarcely imagine. At sea, steamships began to replace sailing vessels, shrinking travel times and knitting together the global economy. The world, once vast and slow, was becoming smaller and faster. The Industrial Revolution was not just about machines and factories. It was about people and society. Cities swelled as workers left the countryside for industrial centers. Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool exploded in size, becoming hubs of industry and commerce. Urban life brought new opportunities, but also new challenges: overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and rising pollution. Chimneys belched smoke into the skies, rivers ran black with industrial waste, and disease spread rapidly through densely packed neighborhoods. Yet, alongside these hardships came new forms of community, political organization, and cultural expression. Industrialization reshaped not only how people worked, but how they lived, thought, and related to one another. This transformation was not limited to Britain. The ideas and technologies of the Industrial Revolution soon spread to Europe, North America, and beyond. Each region adapted industrialization to its own circumstances, yet the underlying pattern was similar: the adoption of new energy sources, the rise of factories, and the reorganization of societies around industrial production. The ripple effects were global. Raw materials were drawn from colonies and distant lands, feeding the machinery of European industry. Finished goods were exported around the world, creating new markets and new dependencies. The Industrial Revolution was thus not just a national event, but a global one, intertwining distant economies and peoples in new ways. But as with any great change, the Industrial Revolution was not without conflict. Workers, facing long hours and dangerous conditions, began to organize. The early labor movement emerged in response to exploitation, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and safer workplaces. Strikes, protests, and at times violent clashes marked the struggle for workers' rights. Governments and industrialists resisted, but over time, reforms were won. Child labor laws, limits on working hours, and the rise of trade unions gradually improved conditions, though inequality remained a persistent feature of industrial society. These struggles remind us that history is not only shaped by inventors and machines, but also by ordinary people fighting for dignity and justice. The Industrial Revolution also transformed ideas. Philosophers, economists, and social critics grappled with the implications of industrialization. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations laid out the principles of capitalism, celebrating the power of markets and specialization. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, observing the hardships of the working class, offered a radical critique, calling for the overthrow of capitalist systems in favor of socialism. Debates about progress, inequality, and the role of technology became central to modern thought, debates that continue to resonate today. One of the most striking legacies of the Industrial Revolution was its impact on the environment. The reliance on coal and steam created unprecedented levels of air and water pollution. Forests were cut, landscapes scarred, and cities choked with smoke. For the first time in history, human activity began to alter the planet on a massive scale. The seeds of our current environmental challenges, climate change, resource depletion, and ecological imbalance can be traced back to this era of industrial growth. Progress and its costs were intertwined, a dual legacy that we continue to navigate. Yet, to view the Industrial Revolution solely through the lens of hardship would be incomplete. It was also a time of incredible creativity, resilience, and human ingenuity. Scientific knowledge expanded, new professions emerged, and standards of living slowly rose over time. The production of goods became cheaper, making once luxury items accessible to ordinary people. Railways connected distant towns. To understand the full sweep of the Industrial Revolution, we need to look not just at machines and inventions, but at the social worlds they created. Imagine standing in a factory town like Manchester during the early 19th century. The skyline is crowded with chimneys, each spewing out thick black smoke. The streets are bustling with workers heading to long shifts. The air is heavy with soot, and the sound of machines echoes from massive textile mills. For someone born just a generation earlier in a quiet farming village, the transformation would have been overwhelming, like stepping into an entirely different age. Factories were both marvels of efficiency and symbols of human struggle. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of relentless noise, dangerous machinery, and strict discipline. Workers, men, women, and even children as young as 6 labored for 12 to 16 hours a day, often 6 days a week. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent, and accidents were common. A hand caught in a machine could mean permanent injury, and respiratory illnesses were widespread due to poor ventilation and constant exposure to cotton fibers or coal dust. These realities raised uncomfortable questions about the price of progress. Was the pursuit of industrial growth worth the cost in human suffering? For many, it was a question without an easy answer. Child labor, in particular, became a central issue. Families struggling to survive often sent their children to work in factories, mines, or as chimney sweeps. Children could crawl into tight spaces where adults could not, making them useful for dangerous tasks. Yet the toll on young bodies and minds was devastating. Social reformers like Lord Ashley, also known as the Earl of Shaftesbury, campaigned tirelessly to improve conditions. Their efforts eventually led to laws restricting child labor and requiring some access to education. But these reforms came only after decades of exploitation and suffering. The living conditions of industrial workers were equally grim. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham grew so rapidly that housing could not keep pace. Families were crammed into poorly built tenements with little light, poor ventilation, and no sanitation. Water sources were often contaminated, and diseases like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis spread quickly. Life expectancy in some industrial cities was shockingly low compared to rural areas. For many, industrialization meant not only long hours of work, but also a precarious existence in environments fraught with disease and hardship. Yet even amid such struggles, workers found ways to build community. Public houses and taverns became centers of social life, places where workers could share stories, songs, and solidarity. Friendly societies and early labor organizations emerged, providing mutual aid in times of sickness or unemployment. These institutions laid the groundwork for the labor unions and social movements that would later play pivotal roles in shaping industrial society. As workers organized, they began to push back against the harshest aspects of industrialization. The Luddites, a group of skilled textile workers in the early 1800s, became famous for smashing machines they believed threatened their livelihoods. To many, they symbolized resistance to technological change. While the government cracked down harshly on Luddite uprisings, their actions reflected the anxieties of a society in transition. Over time, more structured forms of worker activism emerged. The Chartist movement in Britain, for example, campaigned for political reforms like universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and fairer representation. Though not all their demands were met immediately, they planted seeds of democratic change that would bear fruit in later decades. Alongside worker struggles, the Industrial Revolution spurred profound cultural shifts. The rhythms of daily life were no longer tied to the rising and setting of the sun, but to the ticking of factory clocks. Time discipline became a new social norm, enforced by employers who demanded punctuality and productivity. This change might seem subtle, but it fundamentally altered how people perceived their lives. Work was no longer a task to be completed, but a set of hours to be endured. Leisure, too, was reshaped, now confined to evenings and Sundays. The very concept of time became industrialized. Industrial cities also gave rise to new forms of entertainment and culture. Music halls, theaters, and later cinemas provided escapes from the monotony of factory life. Sporting clubs and associations began to flourish, offering opportunities for recreation and community pride. Education, once a privilege of the elite, gradually expanded as reformers recognized the importance of literacy and numeracy in an industrial economy. By the mid-19th century, movements for public education were gaining ground, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared to navigate the complexities of modern society. The economic impact of industrialization was profound. Britain, often called the workshop of the world, became a global leader in manufacturing. Its factories churned out textiles, iron, steel, and countless other products that were exported around the globe. Wealth flowed into the country, fueling the rise of a new middle class composed of factory owners, merchants, and professionals. This middle class embraced values of hard work, respectability, and self-improvement, reshaping cultural norms in the process. Meanwhile, the traditional aristocracy found its dominance challenged by these new industrial elites, leading to shifts in social hierarchy. The global ripple effects of industrialization were enormous. Colonies provided raw materials like cotton, sugar, and rubber, which fed industrial production. In return, industrial powers exported finished goods, often undermining local industries in colonized regions. India, for instance, once famous for its hand-woven textiles, saw its traditional industries collapse under the flood of cheap British cloth. The economic imbalance between industrial and non-industrial nations widened, laying the foundations of modern global inequality. Industrialization was not just a domestic transformation, it was a global reordering of power and resources. The United States, too, became a major player in the industrial story. While Britain led the early stages, America rapidly embraced industrialization in the 19th century. The abundance of natural resources, a growing population, and a spirit of innovation fueled American industry. Textile mills appeared in New England, powered by water and later by steam. The development of interchangeable parts by innovators like Eli Whitney revolutionized manufacturing, making mass production possible. Railroads expanded across the continent, binding together vast territories and stimulating economic growth. By the late 19th century, the United States had become an industrial giant, rivaling and even surpassing Britain in some sectors. Europe followed a similar trajectory, though with regional variations. France industrialized more slowly, balancing traditional agriculture with new industries. Germany, particularly after unification in 1871, became a powerhouse in chemicals, steel, and engineering. Belgium, with its rich coal deposits, industrialized early, while countries like Russia lagged behind until the late 19th and early 20th century. Each nation's path reflected its resources, politics, and social structures, but the common thread was clear: industrialization was transforming the face of Europe. As industrial economies grew, so too did scientific knowledge and technological innovation. The 19th century witnessed an explosion of discoveries. In chemistry, figures like Dmitry Mendeleev organized the periodic table, while advancements in medicine, such as the discovery of germ theory by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, dramatically improved public health. Engineering breakthroughs produced stronger bridges, taller buildings, and more efficient machines. Communication was revolutionized by the telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse, which allowed messages to travel across continents and oceans in moments rather than weeks. Later, the telephone and the electric light would further transform daily life. The Industrial Revolution was not confined to steam and coal. It was a springboard for a century of relentless innovation. Yet, amid the triumphs, darker undercurrents persisted. Industrialization often deepened social divides, with the wealthy reaping immense profits while workers struggling to make ends meet. Women in particular faced unique challenges. While many worked in factories, they often earned lower wages than men for similar tasks. Social norms continued to confine women to domestic roles, even as industrial society depended on their labor. The tension between economic necessity and cultural expectations shaped the experiences of countless women, setting the stage for later movements for gender equality. Environmental consequences also grew more severe. Forests were cleared for timber and farmland, rivers polluted by industrial waste, and cities enveloped in smog. The phrase, "the dark, satanic mills," immortalized by poet William Blake, captured the sense of both awe and horror that factories inspired. For the first time, humans were altering the planet on an unprecedented scale, a legacy that would have consequences far beyond the 19th century. Despite these challenges, many people saw industrialization as a symbol of progress. Exhibitions like the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London celebrated human achievement and innovation. Housed in the Crystal Palace, a massive glass and iron structure, the exhibition displayed inventions and products from around the world. Visitors marveled at steam engines, textiles, and intricate machinery, evidence of the power of industry to reshape the world. Such spectacles reinforced the belief that industrialization was not just an economic transformation, but a civilizational leap forward. The Industrial Revolution also redefined the relationship between humans and nature. No longer bound by the limits of manual labor or animal power, societies could exploit energy on a scale unimaginable to previous generations. Coal was the lifeblood of industry, but it was also a finite resource, extracted at great human and environmental cost. This new relationship with energy foreshadowed future dilemmas: how to balance progress with sustainability, power with responsibility. By the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution had become a defining force of modernity. Its influence extended far beyond Britain's borders, reshaping global trade, politics, and culture. The expanding railway networks and steamships did more than carry goods; they carried ideas, people, and power. The industrial age was not confined to factories and mines. It was a revolution that reached into the very heart of empires and everyday life. Britain's industrial might gave it a commanding role on the world stage. Textiles produced in Manchester, known as Cottonopolis, found their way into markets as far as India, Africa, and the Americas. Coal and iron fed a global machine of commerce and empire. The British Navy, reinforced by steam-powered vessels, ensured the protection of trade routes and the projection of power. Industrialization and imperialism were deeply intertwined, each feeding the other. Colonies provided raw materials: cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, rubber from Southeast Asia, and in turn, they became captive markets for manufactured goods. This created a global economic system in which industrial powers dominated, while colonized regions often saw their traditional economies disrupted or destroyed. Yet industrialization was not only an instrument of domination, it also accelerated exchanges of knowledge and culture. Missionaries, merchants, and travelers carried not only goods, but also scientific discoveries and social ideas across continents. The telegraph, strung across oceans and continents, made communication almost instantaneous compared to earlier eras. A world that had once seemed vast and disconnected was now bound together by the invisible threads of industry and information. The global village was being born. At the same time, industrialization provoked deep anxieties and critiques. Writers, poets, and thinkers grappled with the meaning of these transformations. Charles Dickens captured the struggles of the urban poor in novels like Hard Times and Oliver Twist, portraying the human cost of industrial progress. William Blake's haunting imagery of dark, satanic mills expressed both fear and outrage at the dehumanizing aspects of mechanization. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill wrestled with the tension between economic growth and human well-being, advocating reforms to temper the harshness of laissez-faire capitalism. These voices remind us that the Industrial Revolution was never a simple story of triumph. It was a contested landscape of hope, despair, and competing visions of the future. One of the most striking arenas of change was the family. In pre-industrial societies, family life was centered on the household as a unit of production, with men, women, and children all contributing to farming or craft work. Industrialization fractured this model. Men often worked in factories or mines, while women juggled domestic responsibilities with low-paid factory or textile work. Children, too, became part of the labor force, though gradually reforms reduced their exploitation. The separation between home and work grew sharper, with profound effects on gender roles and expectations. Middle-class ideals of domesticity elevated the role of women as guardians of the home, even as working-class women continued to labor in both factories and households. These shifting dynamics laid the groundwork for later debates over women's rights and gender equality. Education became another battleground of industrial change. As machines grew more complex and economies more interconnected, literacy and technical knowledge became increasingly important. Reformers argued that education was not merely a luxury, but a necessity for modern societies. In Britain, the Factory Act of 1833 required children working in factories to receive at least some schooling, though the quality was often poor. By the late 19th century, public education systems were expanding, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to navigate the challenges of industrial society. Education was both a tool of empowerment and a means of social control, teaching discipline and punctuality to future workers. Meanwhile, the sciences flourished under the conditions of industrial society. Laboratories and universities received new investments, and scientific knowledge was applied to practical problems on an unprecedented scale. Chemistry advanced rapidly, producing new dyes, fertilizers, and medicines. Engineering achievements transformed landscapes. Bridges like the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Britain and the Brooklyn Bridge in the United States became icons of industrial ingenuity. Medicine made great strides, as antiseptics and anesthesia revolutionized surgery, and public health campaigns began to combat epidemics in crowded cities. The Industrial Revolution was not just about machines, it was about the birth of a new relationship between science, technology, and daily life. The second half of the 19th century saw the rise of what some historians called the Second Industrial Revolution. If the first revolution was driven by coal, steam, and textiles, the second was powered by steel, electricity, and chemicals. Innovations such as the Bessemer process dramatically reduced the cost of steel production, enabling the construction of skyscrapers, railroads, and ships. Electricity, harnessed through the work of inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, transformed homes, streets, and factories. Chemical industries developed new products ranging from synthetic dyes to explosives. The internal combustion engine, perfected in the late 19th century, set the stage for automobiles and airplanes. Industrialization was not slowing down, it was accelerating into new frontiers. As industries expanded, so too did the labor movements that challenged them. Strikes, protests, and union organizing became central features of industrial societies. In the U.S., events like the Haymarket Affair of 1886 highlighted the tensions between workers and employers, sometimes erupting in violence. In Europe, socialist parties gained strength, inspired by Marxist critiques of capitalism. The call for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions resonated across continents. Governments, once hesitant to intervene, began enacting labor laws and social welfare measures, seeking to balance industrial growth with social stability. These struggles forged the foundations of the modern labor rights movement and reshaped the relationship between state, worker, and employer. While workers organized, industrial capitalists amassed unprecedented fortunes. Figures like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads became symbols of immense wealth and influence. Their empires transformed industries and reshaped economies, but they also provoked debates about inequality and monopoly power. Were these captains of industry, heroic innovators, or robber barons who exploited workers and crushed competition? The answer, as always, depended on perspective. What is certain is that industrial capitalism created new extremes of wealth and poverty, challenging societies to rethink the meaning of fairness, opportunity, and justice. The Industrial Revolution also reshaped art and culture in surprising ways. Painters and writers sought to capture the new realities of industrial life. The Romantic movement, with figures like J.M.W. Turner, depicted both the sublime beauty and terrifying power of industrial landscapes. Later, realist artists like Gustave Courbet portrayed the gritty lives of workers, while Impressionists captured the fleeting rhythms of modern urban life. Literature, too, reflected these changes. From the social critiques of Dickens to the dystopian visions of H.G. Wells, the industrial age became a canvas for exploring humanity's triumphs and tragedies. Culture was no longer separate from industry, it was shaped by it. Global consequences of industrialization continued to unfold. Japan, after centuries of isolation, embarked on a rapid industrialization program during the Meiji Restoration of the late 19th century. Determined not to be left behind, Japan imported Western technologies, reformed its institutions, and built factories, railroads, and a modern military. Its transformation from a feudal society to an industrial power within a few decades stunned the world and demonstrated that industrialization was not the exclusive domain of the West. Other regions, however, struggled. In Africa and much of Asia, colonial domination stifled local industrial growth, leaving them suppliers of raw materials rather than industrial powers in their own right. The uneven geography of industrialization created patterns of inequality that persist to this day. The environmental impact of industrialization became increasingly undeniable. Forests fell, rivers were poisoned, and urban air grew thick with pollutants. In London, the infamous Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames River reeked with untreated sewage, forced Parliament to take action. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette designed modern sewer systems, marking the beginning of urban environmental management. Yet the larger issue of reliance on fossil fuels remained unresolved. Industrial societies were consuming coal and later oil at unprecedented rates, setting humanity on a path toward ecological crises that would not fully emerge into the 20th and 21st centuries. The Industrial Revolution taught us how to wield power, but it also introduced questions of sustainability that continue to haunt us. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Industrial Revolution was its reshaping of human imagination. For the first time, people began to expect rapid, constant change. The future was no longer an echo of the past. It was an open horizon of possibilities. This faith in progress, in the ability of human ingenuity to solve problems and create new worlds, became a defining feature of modern thought. Yet along with this optimism grew fears of alienation, exploitation, and the loss of human connection in a mechanized world. The Industrial Revolution gave us both the dream of utopia and the specter of dystopia, a duality that still defines our visions of the future. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution had set humanity on a course from which there was no turning back. Nations competed for industrial supremacy, empires expanded to secure resources, and societies were reshaped by machines. The 20th century opened with the full force of industrialization propelling humanity into new and uncharted territory. The revolution that had begun in textile mills and coal mines had spread across the globe, transforming every aspect of life. Cities now glittered with electric lights, railroads stitched continents together, and telegraphs and telephones connected people across vast distances. Yet beneath this veneer of progress lay tensions and contradictions that would soon erupt into global conflict. Industrialization was inseparable from the rise of modern warfare. The same factories that produced textiles and tools could be repurposed to manufacture rifles, cannons, and shells. Advances in metallurgy and chemistry enabled the creation of more powerful weapons, while railways allowed armies to move with unprecedented speed. The First World War was, in many ways, the grim culmination of industrial society's capacity for destruction. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas, and heavy artillery turned the landscapes of Europe into wastelands. The war demonstrated with horrifying clarity that industrial power could be harnessed not only for progress, but also for devastation on a global scale. Yet even amid such destruction, the Industrial Revolution's momentum did not slow. After the war, industries adapted once more, shifting to produce automobiles, household appliances, and consumer goods for peacetime economies. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, showcased the power of mass production and consumer culture. Assembly line techniques, pioneered by Henry Ford in the automobile industry, allowed goods to be manufactured more cheaply and efficiently than ever before. Cars, radios, and refrigerators entered ordinary households, redefining standards of living. Industrialization was no longer just about producing necessities. It was about creating new desires, fueling a culture of consumption that would dominate the 20th century. Electricity became a defining feature of the new industrial age. Homes were illuminated by electric light bulbs, replacing gas lamps and candles. Factories ran more efficiently with electric motors, and new industries sprang up around this transformative power. The spread of electricity reshaped daily rhythms, extending work and leisure into the night and powering everything from streetcars to cinemas. Industrialization was no longer limited to the physical machinery of coal and steam. It was increasingly tied to the invisible flow of electrons, sparking a technological revolution that touched every corner of life. The Great Depression of the 1930s exposed vulnerabilities in the global industrial economy. Factories that had once hummed with activity fell silent, and millions of workers found themselves unemployed. The collapse of markets highlighted the dangers of overproduction, inequality, and economic instability within industrial capitalism. Governments responded in different ways. Some embraced social welfare programs, others turned toward authoritarian regimes that promised stability through state-controlled industry. The Industrial Revolution had created immense wealth, but it had also created fragility, reminding societies that progress could not be taken for granted. World War II once again revealed the industrial foundations of modern power. The conflict became a struggle not only of armies, but of factories, resources, and logistics. Nations that could outproduce their enemies gained decisive advantages. American factories, for example, produced planes, tanks, and ships at astonishing rates, fueling the Allied war effort. The war also spurred innovations such as radar, jet engines, and nuclear technology, many of which would reshape the post-war world. The Industrial Revolution had blurred the line between civilian and military life, as entire economies were mobilized for total war. In the aftermath of World War II, industrialization entered yet another phase. The rebuilding of Europe and Japan, fueled by initiatives like the Marshall Plan, unleashed new waves of economic growth. Factories expanded, new technologies spread, and standards of living rose rapidly. Consumer goods became more accessible than ever, from televisions to washing machines, transforming daily life. The economic miracles of West Germany and Japan showcased the resilience and adaptability of industrial societies. Industrialization was now tied not only to production, but to modernization itself, the promise of prosperity through technology and growth. At the same time, new global patterns of industrialization emerged. Former colonies, newly independent in the mid-20th century, sought to industrialize as a path to development. Nations like India pursued ambitious programs of industrialization, building steel mills, dams, and factories as symbols of modern progress. Others, such as South Korea and Taiwan, embraced export-oriented industrialization, rapidly transforming into economic powerhouses. The Industrial Revolution had long since ceased to be a British or European phenomenon. It had become the shared aspiration of nations across the globe. Yet with industrialization came new challenges. Pollution reached alarming levels, with smog choking cities from London to Los Angeles. Rivers and lakes became dumping grounds for industrial waste. The natural world seemed increasingly fragile under the weight of human industry. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, exposed the dangers of chemical pesticides, sparking the modern environmental movement. For the first time, large numbers of people began to question whether industrial progress could be reconciled with ecological sustainability. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity unprecedented power, but it had also forced societies to confront the consequences of wielding that power irresponsibly. Social transformations continued as well. The labor movement, which had fought so hard in the 19th century, achieved new victories in the 20th. Minimum wage laws, health and safety regulations, and social security systems became standard features of industrial democracies. At the same time, women who had entered factories in large numbers during both world wars increasingly demanded equal rights and opportunities. The feminist movement challenged long-standing gender roles, arguing that industrial society could not be truly modern while half its population was denied equality. Civil rights movements, too, drew strength from industrial labor and urban communities, pushing for justice in societies that had been transformed by factories and cities. The later 20th century saw the rise of what some have called the Third Industrial Revolution. Electronics, computers, and digital technologies began to transform economies as profoundly as steam and steel had in earlier eras. Microchips replaced gears, and information became as valuable as coal. While some argue that this marked the beginning of a new era distinct from the Industrial Revolution, it is perhaps more accurate to see it as a continuation, a new phase in humanity's ongoing industrial story. The logic of mechanization, mass production, and technological innovation remained at the core, now expressed through silicon and code rather than coal and steam. The Industrial Revolution also reshaped culture and identity in ways that extended far beyond economics. Cities became the centers of art, music, and intellectual life, with industrial landscapes inspiring new forms of creativity. Modernist architects built buildings of steel and glass, celebrating the power of industrial materials. Musicians and writers grappled with the alienation and dynamism of industrial life, producing works that reflected both excitement and anxiety about modernity. The industrial world was not only a place of work and production, it was a place of imagination, where humanity redefined what it meant to live in a constantly changing world. By the close of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution had become a truly global phenomenon. Nations like China embraced industrialization on a massive scale, building factories, cities, and infrastructure at breathtaking speed. The sheer scale of production and consumption reached levels unimaginable to earlier generations. Globalization, powered by industrial technologies, created supply chains that spanned continents, linking distant communities in webs of trade and communication. The Industrial Revolution had not ended. It had simply become the air we breathe, the world we inhabit. Yet, even as it became global, the questions it raised remained unresolved. How could societies balance progress with equity? How could industrialization be harnessed without destroying the environment? How could technological change be managed in ways that serve humanity rather than enslave it? These questions remind us that the Industrial Revolution was never just about machines. It was about choices, values, and visions of the future. The answers are still unfolding today. As the 21st century unfolds, the Industrial Revolution remains both a historical event and an ongoing process. Though its origins lie in the coal mines of Britain and the textile mills of Manchester, its legacy now extends to every corner of the globe, shaping not only economies, but also identities, relationships, and dreams. To understand our present world is to trace the pathways laid down by that revolution, for its consequences are everywhere around us. The environmental challenges that dominate today's headlines, climate change, pollution, deforestation, and biodiversity loss, are the direct descendants of the industrial age. The reliance on fossil fuels, first coal and later oil and gas, enabled humanity to achieve extraordinary feats of production, transportation, and communication. But it also released billions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere, altering the planet's climate systems. Industrial agriculture, born from the mechanization and scientific farming of the 19th century, has expanded to feed billions, yet it has also strained ecosystems and depleted soils. The dilemmas of our century are thus deeply rooted in the choices and innovations of the Industrial Revolution. Progress and peril have always traveled together. At the same time, the social questions raised by industrialization remain pressing. The division between rich and poor, both within nations and between them, has often widened under the pressures of industrial capitalism. Even as new technologies create immense wealth, millions still labor under difficult conditions in factories and mines, echoing the struggles of 19th century workers. In many ways, the sweatshops of today's developing world are mirrors of the textile mills of early industrial Britain, reminders that the human cost of industrial progress has never fully disappeared. Global supply chains, fast fashion, and consumer electronics often hide stories of exploitation that echo the past. Yet it would be a mistake to view the Industrial Revolution only through the lens of exploitation or crisis. It also unleashed profound possibilities. Education, literacy, and scientific knowledge spread more widely than ever before. Vaccines, medicines, and public health systems, products of industrial and scientific progress, have saved millions of lives. The connectivity fostered by industrial technologies has created new forms of solidarity, enabling global movements for justice, equality, and sustainability. The very tools that were once used to control workers or dominate colonies are now also used to resist oppression and imagine new futures. Industrialization has always been double-edged, capable of oppression but also of liberation. Culture, too, continues to be shaped by the industrial legacy. From the novels of Charles Dickens to the dystopian films of the 20th and 21st centuries, the Industrial Revolution has provided a backdrop against which artists and thinkers have wrestled with the meaning of progress. The fascination with machines, cities, and technology persists, whether in the optimism of science fiction or the warnings of cautionary tales. We remain haunted by the same paradox that defined the 19th century, the machine as both savior and threat, a symbol of human ingenuity and of human hubris. The global spread of industrialization has also brought new voices and perspectives into the story. Histories once centered on Britain and Europe are now enriched by accounts from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These regions were not merely passive recipients of industrial power, but active participants, sometimes as sources of raw materials, sometimes as centers of resistance, and increasingly as industrial powers in their own right. China's rise as a manufacturing powerhouse, India's vast industrial workforce, and Brazil's industrial and agricultural expansion all testify to the continuing dynamism of the industrial process. The revolution has never been confined to one place or one time. It is a constantly evolving force that adapts, spreads, and transforms. Looking back, what is perhaps most remarkable about the Industrial Revolution is not just the scale of change, but its speed. In the span of just a few generations, humanity moved from hand-spun cloth to mechanized mills, from horse-drawn carts to steam locomotives, from candlelight to electric illumination. The pace of change has only accelerated since, giving us automobiles, airplanes, computers, and the internet. Each of these transformations can trace its lineage to the industrial innovations of the 18th and 19th centuries. The revolution never ended, it simply evolved. And with each evolution, the questions have deepened. What does it mean to be human in an age of machines? How can societies ensure that technology serves the many rather than the few? How do we balance growth with justice, innovation with sustainability? These are not new questions. They are the same ones asked by workers in Manchester, by reformers in Parliament, by writers and philosophers who looked out at the smoke-filled skies of the 19th century and wondered what future they foretold. We inherit not only the machines of the Industrial Revolution, but the debates, struggles, and hopes that surrounded them. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Industrial Revolution is its impact on human imagination. It taught us to expect change, to anticipate futures radically different from the past. Before, societies often assumed that life would remain largely the same from one generation to the next. After industrialization, the assumption shifted. The future would be faster, brighter, more mechanized. This belief in progress has propelled extraordinary achievements, but it has also created anxieties about what might be lost along the way. In many ways, we are still living in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, not only in our factories and cities, but in our very ideas of time, progress, and possibility. To tell the story of the Industrial Revolution is to tell the story of ourselves. It is the story of coal miners and inventors, of factory workers and entrepreneurs, of reformers and resistors. It is the story of how human beings reshaped their world and, in the process, reshaped themselves. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, of dreams and nightmares, of a world forever in motion. And it is a story that is not yet finished, for we are still, in many ways, living through its unfolding chapters. The Industrial Revolution was never just about machines. It was about power, the power to shape nature, to shape societies, and to shape the future. That power remains with us today in every choice we make about energy, technology, and justice. To understand its history is to recognize both the possibilities and the responsibilities it has left us. For the revolution continues, not in the whirring of looms or the clatter of steam engines, but in the hum of servers, the glow of screens, and the fragile balance of our planet's ecosystems. The echoes of the past are all around us, reminding us that the story of the Industrial Revolution is above all the story of how humanity learned to wield its own power, and how we must decide what to do with it. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.